May 17th, 61 AD. Londinium, Britannia. A Roman merchant named Gaius Suetonius stumbled through the smoking ruins of what had been the province, most prosperous trading settlement. The acrid smell of burnt flesh hung thick in the morning air. Bodies littered the streets, men, women, children, all Roman citizens who had believed themselves safe within the empire's protective embrace. But it wasn't the scale of the massacre that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. It was the teeth marks, deep, crushing wounds torn into throats and limbs, distinctive patterns that no human weapon could create. As he moved through the charred remains of the Forum, Gaius discovered something that made his blood freeze. Scattered among the human bones were the partially consumed bodies of massive dogs, warhounds bred for a single purpose. The Iceni hadn't just attacked with warriors, they had unleashed something far more primal, far more terrifying. But the truth behind these four-legged soldiers of vengeance was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Boudicca rebellion warhounds, and how the Iceni Queen's Mastiffs hunted Roman settlers through burning London, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the darkest chapters of history that textbooks won't tell you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers worldwide. Britannia, 61 AD. The Roman occupation had reached its 17th year. To understand the horror that would unfold in Londinium, you must first understand the powder keg that Roman Britannia had become. The conquest, which had begun under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, had never been complete. Unlike Gaul, which had been pacified decades earlier, the British tribes remained fractious, proud, and dangerously resistant to Roman civilization. The Iceni tribe controlled the territories of what we now call Norfolk and Suffolk. They were wealthy beyond measure, enriched by grain exports and metalwork that rivaled Roman craftsmanship. Their king, Prasutagus, had made a calculated decision: accept Roman client status, maintain tribal autonomy, and preserve his people's way of life. It was a compromise that many tribal leaders had made, a practical solution to an impossible situation. But in the Iceni culture, dogs weren't merely animals, they were sacred. The Celtic peoples of Britain had been breeding war dogs for centuries before the Romans ever set foot on their shores. These weren't the sleek hunting hounds of Roman aristocrats. These were massive, muscular beasts, ancestors of what we would recognize as English Mastiffs and Irish Wolfhounds. Ancient sources describe them as standing waist-high to a grown man, with heads as large as shields and jaws capable of crushing bone. The Greek historian Strabo, writing in the 1st century, noted that British war dogs were so prized that they were exported across the known world as gifts to foreign dignitaries. The Romans themselves had begun importing these animals for use in the arena, where they fought against bears, bulls, and even lions. A single British war dog could fetch the price of a skilled slave in Rome's markets. But for the Iceni, these animals served a purpose beyond warfare. They were guardians of the home, protectors of livestock, and most significantly, companions to the tribe's elite warriors. An Iceni warrior's hound was buried with him, ensuring that he would have protection in the afterlife. To harm an Iceni war dog was to commit a grave insult against the warrior who owned it. This cultural context is crucial to understanding what came next. When King Prasutagus died in 60 AD, he made what he believed was a clever provision in his will. He left his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and to Emperor Nero. In Roman law, this should have guaranteed that his family would retain some power, some dignity. The Iceni would transition peacefully into fuller Roman control, and his bloodline would be respected. He could not have been more wrong. The Roman procurator, Cassius Decianus, saw the king's death not as a diplomatic opportunity, but as a chance for plunder. What happened next is documented in the writings of Tacitus, one of Rome's greatest historians. Roman soldiers were dispatched to the Iceni royal household. Queen Boudicca, Prasutagus's widow, was publicly flogged. Her 2 daughters were raped by Roman soldiers while Iceni nobles were forced to watch. But there's a detail that most historical accounts gloss over, a detail preserved in a fragmentary account from a Roman officer's private correspondence discovered in the 19th century. Before the soldiers violated the royal family, they killed the queen's personal guard dogs, 3 massive red-coated mastiffs that had been with Boudicca since childhood. The soldiers beheaded them in front of her, their bodies left to rot on the steps of the royal residence. In Iceni culture, this wasn't just cruelty, it was sacrilege. It was a declaration that nothing was sacred anymore. Within weeks, something began spreading through the Iceni territories, a rage that transcended politics and entered the realm of the primal. Boudica didn't just call for rebellion. Killed. The depth of the impressions suggested animals weighing well over 200 pounds. The local magistrate ordered the incident classified as vandalism by rebels. The symbolic meaning was acknowledged, but the method was rationalized as simple human cruelty. No one wanted to consider the alternative, that the Iceni were breeding something specifically for war, something that had been brought to the very heart of Roman power in Britain. Incident 3. The merchant caravan, May 1st, 61 AD. A wealthy Roman merchant named Marcus Aurelius Fortunatus was traveling from Londinium to Colchester with a caravan of 6 wagons loaded with wine, olive oil, and luxury goods from Gaul. He had 12 armed guards, a significant deterrent against bandits. They never arrived. Searchers found the wagons 5 miles outside Colchester, overturned and looted. The guards and merchants had been killed, but once again, the manner of death raised questions. Several bodies showed evidence of being run down, pursued across open fields until exhaustion made them easy prey. The pattern of wounds suggested attack by multiple large animals working in coordination, cutting off escape routes and driving victims toward kill zones. One guard had managed to climb a tree before being pulled down. The bark bore deep claw marks 15 feet up the trunk. Investigators found tufts of coarse red and brindle fur caught in the tree's lower branches. When shown to local Britons who had remained loyal to Rome, they identified it immediately as coming from Iceni war mastiffs. The report reached Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus while he was campaigning in Wales, crushing the Druid stronghold on Anglesey. He dismissed it. Trained dogs could not possibly coordinate such sophisticated attacks. The Iceni were using the rumors of warhounds as psychological warfare, nothing more. The real threat was human warriors, and his legions could handle those easily enough. It was the last mistake he would make before the rebellion exploded. Incident 4. The Night of Howling, May 10th, 61 AD. Colchester. Every resident of the Colonia remembered this night. It began just after sunset. A sound rolled across the countryside from the west, from the direction of Iceni territory. It wasn't the howling of wolves. It was deeper, more resonant, and utterly coordinated. Hundreds of voices, perhaps thousands, calling and responding in a pattern that suggested intelligence and purpose. The sound continued for 3 hours, growing closer with each passing minute. Retired legionaries who had fought from Hispania to Parthia stood on Colchester's primitive walls and felt genuine fear for the first time in decades. They knew the sounds of war, the clash of shields, the screams of dying men, the thunder of cavalry charges. But this was something from the realm of nightmare. A merchant's wife named Julia Secunda later provided testimony that was preserved in a letter to her sister in Rome. She wrote, "The dogs of the Britons sang to us that night, and in their song was our death. My husband, who fought at Watling Street and fears no man, barred our door with his own hands and prayed to Mars for protection. We did not sleep. None slept." By morning the howling had stopped, but painted on the walls of the Temple of Claudius, the most sacred Roman structure in Britain, was another message. Written in Latin, using what was later determined to be pig's blood. "The hounds are coming." Governor Paulinus received word of these incidents on May 12th. He was still in Anglesey, having just completed the massacre of the Druid population there. He sent orders to Colchester's small garrison: fortify the Temple of Claudius, send for reinforcements from the 9th Legion, and above all, do not panic the civilian population. It was already too late. Boudica's army was on the march, and running with them were over 2,000 war dogs bred for a single purpose: to hunt Romans through the streets of their own cities. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. The true horror of what these warhounds did in Londinium will shock you. Share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. May 17th, 61 AD. Londinium. When Gaius Suetonius, the merchant we met in the cold open, not to be confused with Governor Suetonius Paulinus, first entered the ruins of Londinium, he believed he had seen the worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. Colchester had already fallen. The 9th Legion had been ambushed and virtually destroyed while attempting to relieve the Colonia. Nearly 2,000 Roman soldiers and an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 civilians had been slaughtered in Colchester alone. But Londinium was different. Londinium was personal. The archaeological record tells us something remarkable about this moment. Excavations conducted in the 1960s, and again in the 2000s, uncovered a distinct layer of red, burnt debris across the old Roman city, roughly 18 inches thick in some places. This destruction layer has been precisely dated to 61% AD through ceramic analysis and radiocarbon dating. It represents the complete and systematic annihilation of Britain's most important commercial center. But it's what else they found in that ash layer that confirms the ancient accounts. Scattered throughout the destruction zone, archaeologists discovered the skeletal remains of dozens of large dogs, far larger than typical Roman or Romano-British domestic animals. Osteological analysis revealed these were massive specimens, with skull structures consistent with molosser breeds, the ancient category that includes mastiffs. Several skeletons showed evidence of violent trauma, sword cuts, spear wounds, indicating they died in combat, but the human remains told an even more disturbing story. Among the burnt ruins of what had been workshops and residences near the Thames, excavators found mass burial pits containing the remains of Roman civilians. Forensic analysis of these bones has revealed patterns consistent with ancient accounts of the rebellion. Many skulls show evidence of blunt force trauma, but a significant percentage, roughly 30% of examined remains, show distinctive perimortem bite marks. The bite force patterns match large carnivores. The spacing and depth of tooth marks are consistent with canines possessing jaw strength similar to modern English Mastiffs, which can exert over 550 pounds of bite force per square inch. For context, that's enough to crush human bone. Let me read you the account that Gaius Suetonius left behind. His testimony survived because he included it in a legal petition to the provincial government, seeking compensation for his losses. The petition was filed with the administrative offices in Verulamium, and fragments of it were recovered during 19th-century excavations. I returned to Londinium on the 7th day after the Queen's forces had withdrawn following the arrival of Governor Paulinus's legions. The city I had known no longer existed. Every structure that could burn had been reduced to ash and charred timber. The forum where I had conducted business for 15 years was a field of rubble. But it was not the destruction of property that broke my spirit. It was the bodies. They lay everywhere, in the streets, in the collapsed buildings, along the riverbank where many had attempted to flee by boat. The count would eventually reach 8,000 souls or more. What disturbed me beyond all measure was the condition of these remains. Many bore wounds that no sword, spear, or axe could make, deep puncture wounds to the throat and chest, limbs severed not by clean cuts but by crushing force. I found the body of Quintus Flavius, a wine merchant I had known for 10 years, whose leg had been torn from his body with such violence that bone fragments were scattered across 20 feet of cobblestone. I found the remains of hunting packs, the dogs of war Thol, that we had heard so many whispers about. Some lay dead beside the Romans they had killed, bearing fatal wounds but having completed their task. These were not natural animals gone mad with bloodlust. These were trained instruments of war, as disciplined as any legionary, but far more terrifying. The archaeological evidence supports every detail of this account. The burn layer contains not just structural debris, but the remnants of systematic destruction. This wasn't a chaotic raid. It was an orchestrated annihilation carried out with military precision. But there's another detail that emerged from multiple survivor accounts and was later confirmed by physical evidence. The war dogs hadn't just killed. They had been trained to hunt specific targets. A Roman auxiliary officer named Decimus Crestinus, who had been in Londinium on leave when the attack began, provided crucial testimony during the subsequent investigation. He managed to escape by hiding in a grain warehouse near the docks. His account describes what he witnessed. The Iceni warriors moved through the city in organized units, herding civilians into kill zones where escape was impossible. But the dogs, the cursed hounds of that demon queen, they moved with even greater purpose. They were released in packs of 5 to 10 animals, each pack seemingly assigned a specific district of the city. What haunts me is their selectivity. They ignored the Britons who lived and worked in Londinium, even those who attempted to hide Roman citizens. They somehow knew, by scent, by sight, by some devilish training, they knew Romans from Britons. I watched a pack corner a group of traders in the marketplace. A Gallic merchant stood among them, speaking perfect Latin, dressed in a Roman toga. The dogs ignored him and tore apart the 2 Romans standing beside him. This detail is chilling because it suggests a level of training that seems almost impossible. But modern military and police dog training has shown that dogs can indeed be trained to distinguish between specific ethnic groups, based on subtle differences in diet, hygiene practices, and even stress pheromones. The Romans used olive oil extensively in their personal care, ate different foods, and wore different types of clothing than native Britons. To a highly trained war dog, these differences would be as obvious as a uniform. The discovery that haunted Governor Paulinus when he finally arrived to survey the destruction wasn't just the scale of the killing. It was the realization that Boudicca had weaponized something primal, something that bypassed all Roman military training and tactical superiority. How do you defend against an enemy that attacks from angles your shields cannot cover, that moves faster than your formations can respond, and that feels no fear of death? The Roman writer Dio Cassius, writing a century and a half later but drawing on contemporary sources, provided a number that has sent chills through historians for nearly 2 millennia. He claimed that 70,000 Romans and their allies died during the Boudiccan rebellion across Colchester, Londinium, and Verulamium. Recent archaeological surveys suggest this number, while possibly inflated, isn't far from the truth. The Iceni and their allied tribes had unleashed something that the Roman Empire, with all its military might, had never encountered before. Not barbarian hordes, not guerrilla insurgency, but rather the systematic application of animal warfare on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world. The Roman response to Boudicca's rebellion and her war hounds was swift, brutal, and methodical, exactly what one would expect from history's most efficient military machine. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus raced back from Wales with elements of the 14th Legion and detachments of the 20th Legion, approximately 10,000 men. According to Tacitus, the most reliable ancient source on these events, he made a calculated decision that reveals how seriously he took the threat. He abandoned Londinium to its fate, refusing to risk his army in an urban battle where the war dogs would hold every advantage. Instead, he chose his ground carefully. Somewhere along Watling Street, the great Roman road that ran northwest from Londinium, he found a location that neutralized Boudicca's advantages: a narrow defile with forests on either side, a sloping approach that would tire the British forces, and most crucially, terrain that would prevent the war dogs from flanking his formations. The exact location of the Battle of Watling Street has never been definitively identified, though scholars have proposed sites near modern-day King's Cross in London or further north in the West Midlands. What we do know from the ancient sources is what happened there. Boudicca arrived with an army estimated at over 200,000 warriors, though modern historians consider this number likely inflated. What isn't in dispute is that the British forces vastly outnumbered the Romans, and running before the battle lines, straining at leather leashes held by specialized handlers, were the war hounds. Paulinus deployed his 10,000 men in a defensive formation with their backs to the forest, creating a killing ground in front of them. The legionaries locked shields, their ranks so tight that the ancient sources describe them as an iron wall. Behind them, archers and auxiliary javelin throwers prepared to provide covering fire. When the British charge began, the handlers released the dogs. What happened next is preserved in multiple Roman accounts because it represented a crucial tactical innovation that would be studied by Roman military academers for generations. Paulinus had ordered his men to do something unprecedented. Rather than maintaining their standard formation against the charge, the front ranks opened deliberate gaps in their shield wall at the last moment before impact. The war dogs, trained to assault a solid shield line, ran directly into these gaps, where the legionaries behind the front rank were waiting with spears already leveled. The narrow passages created kill zones where the dogs' numerical advantage meant nothing. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't use their speed, and were funneled into positions where Roman discipline and training overwhelmed them. According to Tacitus, the dogs were slaughtered in their hundreds within the first 10 minutes of battle. The psychological impact on the British forces was devastating. These animals weren't just weapons, they were sacred guardians, spiritual companions, symbols of the warrior culture itself. Watching them die in such numbers broke something in the British assault. But the battle continued for hours. Boudicca's warriors fought with desperate courage, but Roman discipline eventually prevailed. Tacitus claims that 80,000 Britons died in the battle, while Roman casualties numbered only 400. Modern historians consider these numbers propagandistic, but the outcome isn't in question. The rebellion was crushed, and then came the retaliation. What Paulinus did next is often overlooked in popular histories of the rebellion, but it's crucial to understanding the full scope of what the war hounds represented to Rome. He didn't just pursue military victory, he launched a campaign of extermination against the Iceni dog breeding programs, a fragmentary military document recovered from the Vindolanda tablets. Remarkable wooden tablets discovered in northern England that preserved Roman military correspondence, contains orders that scholars have dated to late 61 AD. The relevant passage reads, "All animals of the British war breed are to be confiscated upon discovery, breeding females to be killed immediately, males to be castrated or killed at discretion of commanding officer. Any Briton found harboring such animals will be subject to capital punishment without trial. This wasn't standard military procedure. This was cultural genocide targeting a specific aspect of Celtic society. Paulinus understood that the war dogs weren't just military assets. They were symbols of resistance, links to had once run free. As for Boudica herself, the ancient sources disagree about her fate. Tacitus claims she took poison rather than face capture. Cassius says she fell ill and died. But there's a detail in the British tribal traditions, recorded by medieval Welsh chroniclers drawing on oral histories, that adds a haunting coda to the story. According to these later sources, when Boudica died, her last 3 warhounds, the survivors of the final battle, refused to leave her body. They had to be killed by the Iceni themselves to allow the queen to be buried. The dogs were interred with her, in the ancient tradition, to protect her in the afterlife. No one knows where Boudica's burial site is located. It remains one of British archaeology's greatest mysteries. But somewhere in the English countryside, perhaps beneath a modern parking lot or housing estate, lies the tomb of the warrior queen and the last of her 4-legged soldiers. The story of Boudica's warhounds extends far beyond a single rebellion in Roman Britain. It represents a pivotal moment in military history and reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of warfare, colonization, and cultural destruction. First, let's address the military implications. The systematic use of war dogs as tactical weapons rather than simple intimidation tools was revolutionary for its time. While dogs had been used in warfare since ancient Egypt, the Iceni approach was different. They weren't just releasing animals to create chaos. They were deploying trained, disciplined units capable of specific missions. This distinction is crucial. Modern military working dog programs, used by the U.S. military, British armed forces, and police units worldwide, are direct descendants of the principles the Iceni demonstrated. The concept of training dogs to distinguish friend from enemy, to operate in coordinated packs, and to target specific objectives didn't originate in modern military science. It originated in ancient Britain, perfected by a culture the Romans considered barbaric. The historical record shows that within a century of Boudica's rebellion, war dogs had become standardized equipment in Roman frontier units. A military manual from the 2nd century AD, attributed to Arrian of Nicomedia, contains detailed instructions for deploying British-bred war dogs against barbarian incursions. The manual explicitly credits the methods of the Britannic tribes, while carefully avoiding mentioning Boudica by name, an omission that speaks volumes about how deeply the rebellion had traumatized Roman cultural memory. But the broader implications extend into areas that make modern readers uncomfortable. The warhounds represent an early example of asymmetric warfare, the use of unconventional tactics by a militarily inferior force to nullify an enemy's conventional advantages. Boudica understood that she couldn't defeat Rome in traditional battle. Roman legions were simply too disciplined, too well-equipped, and too experienced. So she weaponized culture itself. She took something sacred to her people, their spiritual and practical relationship with war dogs, and transformed it into a tactical advantage that bypassed Roman military training. It's a pattern we've seen repeated throughout history, from Hannibal's war elephants to the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, from the mounted archers of the Mongols to modern improvised explosive devices. The uncomfortable truth is that Boudica's rebellion succeeded initially precisely because it embraced total war in a way that shocked Roman sensibilities. The systematic targeting of civilians, the use of terror as a weapon, the deployment of animals trained to hunt specific ethnic groups, these were violations of the Roman conception of civilized warfare. But here's where the historical analysis becomes morally complex. Can we condemn Boudica's tactics when they were a response to Roman atrocities? The public flogging of a queen, the rape of her daughter, the confiscation of Iceni lands, the killing of sacred animals, these were the provocations. The Roman Empire, which claimed to bring civilization and law to barbarian lands, had acted with barbaric cruelty. This moral ambiguity is precisely why the story of the warhounds remains relevant. It forces us to confront questions about the ethics of resistance. When facing an overwhelming oppressor, are there limits to acceptable tactics? When your enemy has already violated every norm of civilized behavior, do you have the right, even the obligation, to respond in kind? The historical record suggests that Roman authorities grappled with these same questions. The rapid replacement of Procurator Cassius Decianus, the more conciliatory policies of his successor, and the explicit language about respecting Celtic traditions all indicate that some Roman officials recognized that their own actions had created the conditions for rebellion. But perhaps the most significant broader implication concerns cultural memory and historical narrative. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of Boudicca's rebellion has been told almost exclusively from Roman sources. Tacitus and Cassius gave us the framework we use to understand these events, but they wrote from the perspective of the empire, not the conquered. Consider how different the story feels when viewed from the Iceni perspective. This wasn't a barbaric uprising led by a savage queen using monsters to massacre innocents. This was a desperate attempt by a brutalized people to reclaim their autonomy using every weapon at their disposal, including the sacred war dogs that represented the best of their warrior culture. The archaeological evidence has begun to shift this narrative. The discovery of mass graves containing Roman civilian remains has confirmed the scale of British anger and the systematic nature of the rebellion's violence. But those same excavations have also revealed the equally systematic nature of Roman retaliation and the deliberate destruction of Celtic cultural practices. The war hounds are central to this revised understanding because they represent something that neither side wanted to acknowledge. To the Romans, they were proof of British barbarity, evidence that the Celtic peoples needed Roman civilization to become fully human. To later British historians, including medieval chroniclers, they were an embarrassment, a reminder that the indigenous peoples of Britain had once embraced a form of warfare that seemed savage by Christian standards. But modern military historians and anthropologists have begun to recognize the Iceni dog breeding and training programs as remarkably sophisticated. These weren't random packs of vicious animals. They were the product of generations of selective breeding, specialized training techniques, and tactical doctrine that rivaled anything in the Roman military manual. DNA analysis of dog remains from Iron Age British sites has revealed something remarkable. The war Mastiffs weren't a single breed but rather a carefully maintained genetic line that combined traits from multiple sources. They possessed the size and bite force of Molosser breeds, the speed and endurance of running hounds, and the intelligence and trainability of herding dogs. Creating and maintaining such a line required knowledge of genetics that wouldn't be formally theorized until Gregor Mendel in the 19th century, yet the Iceni had achieved it through empirical practice. This challenges a fundamental assumption of Roman imperialism, the idea that military superiority equaled cultural superiority. The Romans conquered Britain with legions, but they couldn't replicate the Iceni's relationship with war dogs without destroying the cultural context that made it possible. The lasting impact on British society is visible even today. England has more distinct dog breeds than any other country in the world. The cultural importance of dogs in British identity, from the symbolic Inglis bulldog to the royal corgis, has roots that extend back to before the Roman conquest. The war hounds of Boudicca are part of that continuum, a reminder that the bond between humans and dogs has shaped history in ways we're only beginning to understand. Finally, there's a sobering lesson about historical memory and the stories we choose to preserve. For most of recorded history, Boudicca has been portrayed as either a barbaric savage or a romantic freedom fighter. Both narratives miss the point. She was a political and military leader who made calculated decisions about how to resist an occupying power. Her decision to employ war dogs wasn't born of savagery. It was born of necessity and strategic thinking. The fact that we're still discussing her tactics 2,000 years later suggests she achieved something remarkable. She forced the most powerful empire in the ancient world to change its policies, to reconsider its treatment of conquered peoples, and to acknowledge that even barbarians possessed military innovations worth respecting. The warhounds of the Boudiccan rebellion remind us that history is never simple, that civilization and barbarism are often in the eye of the beholder, and that the desperate actions of oppressed peoples must be understood in their full context. They also remind us that humans have been partnering with dogs for mutual benefit, including in warfare, for thousands of years, and that this partnership has shaped the course of civilizations in ways we're still discovering. What do you think drove Queen Boudicca to weaponize sacred war dogs against Roman civilians? Was this a justified response to Roman atrocities, or did it cross ethical lines that even war should respect? Leave your theories in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives on these complex historical questions. If you want to dive deeper into the dark corners of ancient history, subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We bring you the stories that textbooks leave out, the uncomfortable truths about how our ancestors actually lived and died. Next week, we're investigating the Roman gladiator revolt of 73 BC. and the horrifying conditions in the training schools that drove men to eat the flesh of their dead companions. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember that history is written by the victors, but the truth is buried with the vanquished. See you in the next video.